Title: The Whispering Shadows. Chapter 1. The old house on Willow Street. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked pavement of Willow Street. The old house at the end of the lane stood as a silent sentinel, its windows dark and lifeless. The for sale sign swayed precariously in the wind, the letters faded and barely legible. It had been on the market for years, but no one dared to buy it. The locals whispered about the house, their voices hushed and eyes darting nervously whenever the topic arose. Emma Carter had always been drawn to the mysterious. As a child, she would spend hours reading ghost stories and watching horror movies, much to the dismay of her more sensible friends. Now, as a young woman with a degree in journalism, she saw the old house on Willow Street as the perfect subject for her next investigative piece. The rumors, the history, the eerie atmosphere. It was all too tempting to resist. She parked her car a few houses down, not wanting to draw attention to herself. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from the gutters. Emma grabbed her notebook and camera, slung her bag over her shoulder, and made her way to the house. The front gate creaked ominously as she pushed it open. The garden was overgrown, with weeds choking the life out of what had once been a beautiful flower bed. The path to the front door was cracked and uneven, and Emma had to watch her step to avoid tripping. She reached the porch and hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a loud creak, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The smell of mildew and decay hit her like a wall, and she coughed, covering her nose with her sleeve. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The house was a time capsule frozen in the 1950s. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper. The air was heavy with the weight of years of neglect, and Emma could feel the history of the place pressing down on her. She pulled out her camera and began to take pictures, the flash illuminating the dark corners of the room. As she moved through the house, she noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting in the corners of her vision. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the unease grew with every step she took. She reached the staircase and paused, looking up at the dark void that led to the second floor. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, each step bringing her closer to the unknown. The hallway upstairs was even darker than the one below, and Emma had to rely on her flashlight to see. The beam of light danced across the walls, revealing peeling paint and cracked plaster. She opened the first door she came to and found herself in a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a soft pink, and a dusty dollhouse sat in the corner. The bed was neatly made, as if waiting for its owner to return. Emma felt a pang of sadness as she looked around the room, wondering what had happened to the child who had once lived here. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that she almost missed it, but it was there, just on the edge of her hearing. She froze, her heart racing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and she realized it was coming from the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her mind screaming at her to run, but her curiosity got the better of her. She opened the closet door, and the whisper stopped. The inside was empty, save for a few old coats hanging on the rack. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding and stepped back, closing the door. She turned to leave the room, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. A figure stood behind her, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. Emma spun around, but there was no one there. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. She had seen it, she was sure of it, but how could it have disappeared so quickly? She stumbled out of the room and down the hallway, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she ran. The whispers returned, louder this time, and she could feel them crawling over her skin like insects. She reached the staircase and practically threw herself down the steps, her heart pounding in her ears. As she reached the bottom, she heard a loud crash from upstairs. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. Emma's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the top of the stairs. The footsteps stopped, and the house fell silent once more. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, and she could feel the sweat dripping down her back. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling as she made her way to the front door. She fumbled with the doorknob, her hands slick with sweat, and finally managed to yank it open. She stumbled out into the rain, the cold water soaking through her clothes. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her heart still racing. She threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. She sat there for a moment, trying to catch her breath, her mind replaying what had just happened. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and dark, but for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the window, watching her leave. Chapter 2. The history of the house. Emma spent the next few days researching the history of the house on Willow Street. She visited the local library, scoured old newspapers, and even talked to some of the older residents of the town. What she found was a story that sent chills down her spine. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy businessman named Charles Hargrove. He had moved in with his wife and young daughter, and for a while they seemed like the perfect family. But things took a dark turn when Charles's wife died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental fall down the stairs, but there were whispers of foul play. Charles became a recluse after his wife's death, rarely leaving the house. His daughter, Emily, was sent away to boarding school, and the house fell into disrepair. Years later, Emily returned as a young woman, determined to uncover the truth about her mother's death. She moved back into the house, but within months, she too was dead. The official report said it was suicide, but the townspeople had their doubts. Emily had been a vibrant, happy young woman, and no one could believe she would take her own life. The house was left abandoned, and over the years it gained a reputation for being haunted. People claimed to hear whispers, see shadows moving on their own, and even catch glimpses of a woman in white wandering the halls. Emma's research only deepened her fascination with the house. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. She returned to the house the following weekend, this time with a voice recorder and a more powerful flashlight. The house was just as she had left it, dark and foreboding. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were there again, faint but unmistakable. She turned on her recorder and began to speak, describing what she saw and heard. As she moved through the house, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. There were symbols carved into the walls, hidden beneath the peeling wallpaper. They were strange, almost otherworldly, and they sent a shiver down her spine. She took pictures of them, determined to research them later. She reached the child's bedroom again and hesitated at the door. The whispers were louder here, more insistent. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The closet door was slightly ajar, and she could feel a cold draft coming from it. She approached the closet slowly, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and she could feel them pressing against her skin. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling, and pulled the door open. The inside was empty, just as it had been before. But this time, she noticed something on the floor. It was a small, leather-bound journal, covered in dust. She picked it up and opened it, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It was Emily's diary. Chapter 3. The diary. Emma sat on the dusty floor of the child's bedroom, the diary open in her lap. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The diary started off innocently enough, with entries about Emily's life at boarding school and her hopes for the future. But as she read on, the tone began to change. Emily wrote about strange occurrences in the house, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and a feeling of being watched. She also wrote about her father. Charles had become increasingly erratic after her mother's death, and Emily was convinced that he was hiding something. She began to investigate, searching the house for clues. What she found terrified her. According to the diary, Charles had been involved in occult practices. He had been trying to contact his dead wife, using dark rituals to bring her back. But something had gone wrong. Instead of his wife, he had summoned something else, something malevolent. Emily wrote about the symbols she had found carved into the walls, the same ones Emma had seen. She believed they were part of a ritual to bind the entity to the house, but the binding was incomplete. The entity was trapped, but it was still able to influence the living. The final entries in the diary were the most chilling. Emily wrote about the whispers growing louder, the shadows becoming more aggressive. She believed the entity was trying to possess her, to use her body to complete the ritual and free itself. She was terrified, but she was determined to stop it. The last entry was dated the day before her death. Emily wrote that she had found a way to banish the entity, but it would require a sacrifice. She didn't elaborate, but Emma had a sinking feeling she knew what Emily had meant. Emma closed the diary, her hands trembling. She felt a deep sense of sorrow for Emily, but also a growing sense of dread. If the entity was still trapped in the house, it meant that Emily's sacrifice had failed. And if that was the case, then the house was still dangerous. She stood up, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to banish the entity, to put an end to the curse that had plagued the house for so long. But how? She didn't know the first thing about occult rituals or how to deal with malevolent spirits. As she left the room, she heard the whispers again, louder than ever. They seemed to be coming from all around her, pressing in on her from every direction. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and she spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, but the whispers continued, growing more insistent. She could feel them in her mind, urging her to stay, to join them. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts, but they were relentless. She ran down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The front door was just ahead, but it seemed to be getting farther away with every step she took. The whispers were deafening now, and she could feel the entity's presence all around her. She reached the door and yanked it open, stumbling out into the rain. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and dark, but for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the window, watching her leave. Chapter 4. The ritual. Emma spent the next few days researching the symbols she had found in the house. She scoured the internet, visited occult bookstores, and even reached out to a few experts in the field. What she discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The symbols were part of an ancient ritual used to summon and bind spirits. The ritual was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and specific ingredients. If done correctly, it could trap a spirit in a specific location, preventing it from causing harm. But if done incorrectly, it could unleash the spirit, giving it free rein to wreak havoc. Emma realized that Charles Hargrove had attempted the ritual, but he had made a critical mistake. The binding was incomplete, leaving the entity trapped but still able to influence the living. Emily had tried to banish the entity, but her sacrifice had not been enough. Emma knew what she had to do. She needed to complete the ritual to bind the entity once and for all. But it would require a sacrifice, a life for a life. She thought about Emily, about the courage it must have taken to make that choice. Could she do the same? She spent the next few days preparing. She gathered the necessary ingredients: candles, herbs, a ceremonial dagger, and studied the ritual until she had it memorized. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't let the entity continue to haunt the house, to prey on anyone else who might come looking for answers. She returned to the house on a stormy night, the rain falling in sheets. The house loomed before her, dark and foreboding. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her bag of supplies slung over her shoulder. The whispers were there, as always, but they seemed more agitated, more urgent. She could feel the entity's presence all around her, pressing in on her from every direction. She ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. She set up the ritual in the living room, arranging the candles in a circle and placing the herbs in the center. She lit the candles, the flames flickering in the darkness. The air grew heavy, and she could feel the entity's anger, its desperation. She began to chant the words of the ritual, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but she didn't stop. She could feel the entity fighting against her, trying to break free, but she held firm. As she reached the final words of the ritual, she picked up the ceremonial dagger. Her hands trembled as she held it to her palm, the blade glinting in the candlelight. She took a deep breath and made the cut, her blood dripping onto the herbs. The room exploded in a burst of light, and she felt a wave of energy wash over her. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and then suddenly they stopped. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Emma collapsed to the floor, her strength gone. She lay there for what felt like hours, her mind reeling. She had done it. She had completed the ritual, bound the entity once and for all. But at what cost? Chapter 5, The Aftermath. Emma woke up in the hospital, her body weak and her mind foggy. She had no memory of how she had gotten there, but she could still feel the weight of the ritual, the sacrifice she had made. The doctors told her she had been found unconscious in the old house on Willow Street, her palm cut and her body weak from blood loss. They had no explanation for how she had gotten there or what had happened, but they were just glad she was alive. Emma knew the truth, but she kept it to herself. She had done what needed to be done, and the house was finally at peace. The entity was gone, bound by the ritual, and the whispers had stopped. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. She had sacrificed a part of herself to complete the ritual, and she could feel the entity's presence lingering in the back of her mind, a shadow that refused to fade. She returned to the house one last time, just to make sure. The for sale sign was gone, and the house looked different, somehow less foreboding. She stepped inside, the air heavy with the weight of what had happened. The whispers were gone, but she could still feel the entity's presence, a faint echo in the back of her mind. She knew it would always be there, a reminder of the sacrifice she had made. As she left the house, she glanced in the mirror. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. But when she turned around, there was no one there. She walked away from the house, her heart heavy but her mind at peace. She had done what needed to be done, and the house was finally free. But she knew the shadows would always be with her, whispering in the back of her mind, a reminder of the price she had paid. Epilogue. The house on Willow Street was sold a few months later to a young couple looking for a fresh start. They had no idea of the house's dark history, and Emma didn't have the heart to tell them. She watched from a distance as they moved in, their laughter filling the air. The house looked different now, less foreboding, more welcoming. But Emma knew the truth, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still there, waiting. She turned away and walked down the street, the whispers fading into the distance. She had done what needed to be done, and the house was finally at peace. But she knew the shadows would always be with her, a reminder of the price she had paid. And as she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder if the entity was truly gone, or if it was just waiting, biding its time until it could rise again. The end.